Let me thank everyone for being here this morning, and let me thank Senator Graham for his efforts, and mostly let me thank Shalanda Young, our new OMB director, for being here, and congratulate her on her official appointment. You've been doing the job for a year, now you got the title, right? Let us, as we begin this hearing, let us be very, very clear. A federal budget is more than just a huge spreadsheet of numbers. Federal budget speaks to who we are as a nation and where we want to be in the future. It speaks to whether or not we can go beyond the needs of the lobbyists, whether we can go beyond the needs and the power of wealthy campaign contributors who have so much influence over what goes on here in Capitol Hill, or whether we can finally address the needs of the tens of millions of working families, middle-income people, low-income people who are struggling every single day to take care of their families. That is really what this whole debate is about. Which side are we on? So let me just take a moment to describe what I believe to be some of the major crises in our country today and how the president's budget responds to these crises. Today in our country, the very, very wealthiest people are becoming phenomenally wealthier, while at the same time, over half of the people in this country are living paycheck to paycheck. I know that is not a reality we talk about terribly much, but in fact, that is the simple truth. Millions of American workers are trying to get by on $8 an hour, $9 an hour, $12 an hour, all of which, to my mind, are starvation wages. Nobody, no matter what state you are living in, can get by on those wages. In a State of the Union speech, President Biden called on Congress to increase the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. That is a step forward. We should go further. The federal minimum wage has been stuck at $7.25 an hour for 13 years. 13 years. And if the minimum wage had increased at the rate of productivity since 1968, it would not be $7.25 an hour, it would be $23 an hour. The time is now for Congress to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. Today in America, we have more income and wealth inequality than we have had in 100 years. I understand we don't talk about it. I understand the corporate media doesn't talk about it, but that is the reality. Today in our country, the two wealthiest people now own more wealth than the bottom 42% of our population, 130 million Americans. Two people, 130 million Americans. Anybody think that that is what America is supposed to be about? I don't think so. During this terrible pandemic, which within a few weeks will claim 1 million American lives, when thousands of essential workers died doing their jobs, over 700 billionaires in America became nearly $2 trillion richer. And let me say this, while we hear a whole lot of talk lately in terms of the horrific war in Ukraine, about the need to take on the oligarchs in Russia, something which I very strongly support. Anyone who thinks we do not have an oligarchy right here in America is sorely mistaken. Today in America, multi-billionaires like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson are off taking joyrides on their rocket ships to outer space. They're buying $500 million super yachts. And we talk about the yachts that Putin's friends have. Well, guess what? They have them too here in this country, living in mansions with 25 bathrooms. In his budget, the president has proposed a 20% minimum tax on those who are worth at least $100 million. This is an important step forward, and I congratulate the President for doing that. We should go further, though. In 2020, I introduced a 60% tax on the obscene wealth gains billionaires made during the pandemic, legislation I will soon be reintroducing, and which is precisely what the American people want. They understand. You don't have to be an economist to understand this. They understand there is something fundamentally wrong when so few have so much and so many Americans have so little. Now, I understand that some of my colleagues get very nervous when we talk about wealth distribution. Oh, my goodness, can't talk about that. But here is the reality, and that is that over the last 45 years in this country, there has been a massive, massive redistribution of wealth. The problem is it has gone in precisely the wrong direction. According to the Rand Institute, not a particularly progressive organization, since 1975, 50 trillion, that's a T, $50 trillion in wealth has been redistributed from the bottom 90% to the top 1%, primarily because corporate profits and CEO compensation has grown much faster than the wages of ordinary workers. But it is not just income and wealth inequality that we must address. It is economic and political power. As we discussed in a hearing in this committee last month, three Wall Street firms control over $21 trillion in assets, which is basically the GDP of the United States of America, the largest economy on earth. Three companies control hundreds and hundreds of companies, three Wall Street firms. That's not a problem. I don't know what a problem is. In terms of health care, over 70 million Americans today are either uninsured or underinsured. 60,000 people die each and every year because they can't get to a doctor on time because they don't have insurance, don't have the money for co-payments or deductibles. We remain, my friends, the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people as a human right, and yet we pay the highest prices in the world for health care. In his budget, the President has proposed a substantial increase in investments in mental health, enormously important. Pandemic preparedness, my God, I hope we can pass that. We have to pass that. The Indian Health Service, and research into finding a cure for cancer and other life-threatening diseases. All of those ideas are enormously important. We have got to pass them, but we have got to go further than that. An overwhelming number of Americans, vast majority of the population, want us to expand Medicare to cover dental, hearing, and eyeglasses. In the richest country on earth, senior citizens should not have teeth rotting in their mouths. Further, as a nation, we should understand what every other major country does. Healthcare is a human right, not a privilege. The function of a rational healthcare system is to provide healthcare to all in a cost-effective way, not to allow private insurance companies and private drug companies to make obscene levels of profit. And I'm happy to inform members of this committee that in early May, we will be having a hearing right here in this committee on the need to pass a Medicare for All single-payer program. According to the Congressional Budget Office, Medicare for All, this is the CBO, Medicare for All would save the American people and our entire healthcare system $650 billion each and every year. So I say to all my conservative friends worried about the expenditure of taxpayer money, work with us, pass a Medicare for All single-payer program. But healthcare reform must not only address the private health insurance companies, but the greed of the pharmaceutical industry. Year after year, decade after decade, we're talking about the outrageous cost of prescription drugs in this country, the huge profits of the drug companies. President has proposed, and I agree, that Medicare must negotiate prescription drug prices with the pharmaceutical industry, which is exactly what the Veterans Administration has done for 30 years. If Medicare does that, we lower the cost of prescription drugs by 50%. Not bad. Do we have the courage to take on the hundreds of millions of dollars in lobbyists who are all over Capitol Hill telling us that we got to protect the profits of the industry, or do we stand with the patients and the ordinary Americans who are sick and tired of paying these outrageous prices. And then there is the existential threat of climate change. Well, I don't know what to say about that. Scientists tell us we have a handful of years to transform our energy system, but we're not going to have much of a planet to leave our children and grandchildren. And I hope that we very much have the capability of taking on the greed of the fossil fuel industry and saving this planet for future generations. Now, I understand that my Republican colleagues want to blame inflation on President Biden and the enormously successful American Rescue Plan, but let us be clear. The problem is not that a low-income worker got a 50-cent raise last week and a $1,400 check from the federal government over a year ago. That is not the problem. To a significant degree, pathetically, large corporations are using the war in Ukraine and the pandemic as an excuse to raise prices significantly to make record-breaking profits. This is taking place at the gas pump, at the grocery store, and virtually every other sector of the economy. That is why, in my view, we need a windfall profits tax, and why this committee will be holding a hearing on Tuesday of next week to deal with the unprecedented level of corporate greed that is taking place in America today. I think we can all agree that we are living through an extremely difficult moment in American history. The question before us is whether we will stand with the working families of this country and protect their interest, or whether we stand with the big money interests, the large multinational corporations, and the wealthy campaign contributors who decade after decade have enormous influence over both political parties. Now the President has done his job and submitted his budget to us. It is up to Congress to review it, pass the proposals that make sense, and improve upon them. As chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, I will be doing everything I can to pass a strong and robust budget reconciliation bill that works for working families, not the 1%. With that, let me now recognize the ranking member of this committee, Lindsey Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and here's the other view. The world is on fire. If you don't believe me, turn on your television. Inflation is rampant, and we're more dependent on bad actors for our energy needs than ever. This budget takes all three problems and I believe makes it worse. President Biden ran as a steady hand on national security. How's that working out? He ran as a centrist, consensus-building candidate. Unfortunately, I don't believe that has materialized either, that not only his budget proposals, but his economic proposals on the domestic front would be the largest power grab in modern American history. The budget. More spending, more taxes, more debt at a time we need to go in the other direction. The budget regarding the defense needs of this country is woefully inadequate and dangerous. When you look at over the next decade of how much we spend on defense, you have to ask yourself, the threats we face, are they getting smaller or larger? Look at what's going on in the world today. We have Putin dismembering a democracy called Ukraine in front of us, committing war crimes on an industrial scale, and all of us in a pretty bipartisan fashion have condemned him, and I appreciate that. There's an effort ongoing to do a new Iranian nuclear deal, giving the Ayatollah, who I think is a religious Nazi, more cash and very little in return. You have China being a bad actor all over Asia, threatening to invade Taiwan and rewriting the world map. You got Rocket Man in North Korea shooting missiles into the sea by the day and trying to get some attention out there. And you have Chinese buildup of their military. You have the reemergence of terrorism in Afghanistan from that debacle. ISIS and Al-Qaeda now have a safe haven. And you've got an invasion of illegal immigrants coming across our border. And if you repeal Title 42 deportation authority regarding COVID, then you will have just an absolutely overwhelming wave of legal immigration this summer. So those are the threats we face in today, and I don't think they're getting better anytime soon. In terms of spending, in the president's budget, non-defense spending goes up 11.3% in 2022 and 2023. Defense goes up 4%. Now, given the threats we face, does that make any sense? The answer is no. Over a 10-year window here, non-defense spending goes up 4.5%, defense spending goes up 2.2%. I don't know what my friends on the other side are looking at, but I don't see the world getting safer anytime soon, and we had one heck of a fight to increase defense spending in the last omnibus negotiations, and everything I see on the world stage is deteriorating, and we need more defense spending, not less. Percentage of GDP spent on defense. The chairman said something I agree with. Budgets reflect who you are and what kind of country you want to have and what kind of world we're in. So by 2032, we'll be spending 2.4% of GDP on defense. That will be an all-time historic low. And again, as you look in the out years in the next decade, with China developing hypersonic weapons capability, aircraft carriers, Putin trying to rewrite the map of Europe, the Iranians trying to develop ballistic missiles, North Korea being a bad actor, do you really believe that we should have the lowest spending GDP-wise on defense in the history of the country in the next decade? I do not. We're going to triple the amount of money we pay on interest over the next decade. So $1.1 trillion by FY 2032 will just cover the interest payments. This budget also is about values. In this budget, we do away with the Hyde protections. Most Americans oppose taxpayer-funded money in the area of abortion. That's been the policy of the country for decades. This budget eliminates that restriction so taxpayer dollars can be spent on abortion. I think that is against the will of the American people. So what have we laid out here? We've laid out a budget that does not recognize the threats we face today and in the coming years on defense. We've laid out a budget that's going to explode the amount of interest we pay on the debt, and we all should be working to go the other way. In this budget, we do away with tax advantages that oil and gas companies have to explore for new oil and gas that we own. I find it odd that we're asking OPEC nations to produce more, talking to Venezuela, and maybe encouraging Iran to produce more oil and gas as we shut down our ability in this country to produce oil and gas. Count me in on the climate change front, but count me out when it comes to making our nation more dependent on foreign oil and gas, and that's just a reality we face. So, Mr. Chairman, I think what we have here is a different view of the world in which we live, the priorities we should have in terms of how to defend the nation, and this effort to make us more energy dependent is going to, I think, make the world a more dangerous place. As we're trying to get off oil and gas supplied by Russia and Iran and other bad actors, we're shutting down American production. Inflation is rampant. If this budget ever became law, what you're paying at the gas pump would go up dramatically because our ability to produce oil and gas here at home would be virtually non-existent if this budget became law. If we spend all this money, particularly on the domestic side, the inflationary problems we have today only get worse. So with all due respect, I think everybody on this side of the aisle will oppose this budget, and I would like to have an actual vote on the budget. I'd like to see how many of my Democratic colleagues would vote for this budget. So I welcome a debate on the floor and a vote on this budget as presented, and I hope we can agree on that this is something should be debated and voted on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Graham. Our witness today is Shalanda Young. She was, as I think all know, confirmed several weeks ago in a strong bipartisan vote to her position, and we welcome her for being with us today. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Chairman Sanders, Ranking Member Graham, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on President Biden's fiscal year 2023 budget. Under the President's leadership, our country has made historic progress in the face of unprecedented challenges. We created more than 6.5 million jobs in 2021, the most our country has ever recorded in a single year. Our economy grew at 5.7%, the strongest growth in nearly 40 years. The unemployment rate has fallen to 3.8%, the fastest decline in recorded history. And the deficit is on track to drop $1.3 trillion, the largest ever one-year decline. This progress was not by accident. It is a direct result of this president's strategy to combat the pandemic and grow our economy from the middle out and the bottom up. The president's 2023 budget details his vision to expand on that progress and deliver the agenda he laid out in his State of the Union: to build a better America, reduce the deficit, reduce costs for families, and grow the economy from the bottom up and the middle out. Since taking office, the president has put forth proposals to Congress that would lower health care, child care, energy, and other costs for families, reduce the deficit, and expand our economy's productive capacity. The budget reflects his commitment to working with Congress to pass legislation that achieves those goals. This budget advances a bipartisan unity agenda, including proposals to combat the opioid epidemic, tackle the mental health crisis, support our veterans, and accelerate progress against cancer. I'd like to point out that all of those proposals are on the non-defense side of the ledger. It builds on the bipartisan funding bill Congress passed earlier this month and makes key investments in the American people, from expanding economic capacity and improving our public health infrastructure to combating the climate crisis and advancing equity, dignity, and security for all Americans. And during what will be a decisive decade for the world, the budget strengthens our military and leverages America's renewed strength at home so our nation is prepared to meet pressing global challenges and manage crises as they arise. With robust investments in our diplomatic and development agencies, the national security budget as a whole will deepen partnerships and alliances and position the United States to compete with China and any other nation from a position of strength. As we've seen over the past month, our renewed partnerships and alliances have been vital to countering Russian aggression. And I'd like to thank Congress for the supplemental funding to support Ukraine and our regional partners. The budget makes these investments in a fiscally responsible way, reducing deficits by more than $1 trillion and improving our country's long-term fiscal outlook. That's because the budget's investments are more than fully paid for through tax reforms that ensure corporations and the wealthiest Americans pay their fair share. That includes a new proposal requiring the richest Americans to pay a tax rate of at least 20% on all their income, including investment income that currently goes untaxed. The budget also fulfills the president's promise that no one earning less than $400,000 a year will pay a single penny in new taxes. And it would reduce the deficits to less than half of last year's levels as a share of the economy, while keeping the economic burden of debt low. Overall, the budget puts forward an economically and fiscal responsible path addressing our nation's long-term fiscal challenges while marking smart investments that will produce stronger growth and broadly shared prosperity for generations to come. Thank you for allowing me to testify, for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Director. I want to pick up on a point that you made regarding tax policy. As I understand it, in 2020, 55 large multinational corporations paid nothing, zero, not a penny, in federal income taxes after making $40 billion in profits. The effective tax rate of billionaires in America is now 8%, which is lower than what a nurse, teacher, firefighter, or truck driver pays. What is the president trying to do in his budget to address this outrageous inequity?
So many of the people you just referred to, nurses, teachers, firefighters, pay at least double of what the effective tax rate is for billionaires and those that make more than $100 million. So the president believes very strongly that billionaires and those worth more than $100 million should pay what firefighters, teachers, and nurses pay as their effective tax rate.
During your presentation, you mentioned the issue of mental health. I think we have long had in this country a mental health crisis without enough practitioners. Clearly, the pandemic has made a very bad situation worse. Last year, we lost some 100,000 Americans to drug overdoses. What in this budget are you presenting to us that will deal with the mental health crises facing America?
Mr. Chairman, we certainly hope, as the President mentioned in the State of the Union, this brings all sides together. And the President believes that mental health, for example, should be covered just like physical health. So our proposal is that insurance companies have to cover mental health services as they do any other ailment that Americans suffer.
Madam Director, the scientific community is fairly clear. You know, we get distracted by the terrible war, Putin's war in Ukraine. We get distracted by a lot of things, but climate change is real. And what scientists tell us, if we do not act extremely boldly in transforming our energy system in the next few years, the planet we leave future generations becomes increasingly unhealthy and uninhabitable. What does the President have in this budget to deal with climate?
Mr. Chairman, the President would invest over $40 billion to deal with the climate crisis, as he's called it. That includes our commitment to ensure that the poorest countries in the world can also step up and meet these challenges. This is a global problem, and if we don't deal with this domestically and in an international fashion, we will not meet the goals necessary before we reach a point of no return.
The American people are disgusted by the reality that we pay the highest prices in the world by far for prescription drugs. What is the President proposing that we do to lower the cost of prescription drugs in this country?
So the President has been clear. He continues to believe that Congress should send him a package of legislative package that reduces the cost of prescription drugs, reduces the cost of child care for families, reduces health care costs. And this budget leaves the revenue space in which to do that, including the savings. We don't have to spend anything. We actually save money if we lower the cost of prescription drugs.
During the American Rescue Plan, we did something I think extraordinarily important, and that is extended and expanded the child tax credit for working class parents. That expired in January. The child poverty rate skyrocketed by 41%, bringing us back to one of the highest childhood poverty rates of any major country on earth. What is the President proposing we do to address child poverty in America?
You heard from the President in the State of the Union. He continues to believe that the child tax credit should be extended. You're absolutely right. It brought down the poverty level substantially for children in this country. The President, from his own lips, has recommitted to supporting that effort.
Okay. Well, Director Young, thank you very much. Senator Graham.
Good morning, Ms. Young.
Good morning.
Good. Would you support a vote on the Senate floor regarding the President's budget?
Thank you, Senator Graham. As a former longtime staffer of the Hill, I would not deign to tell the Senate how to conduct its business.
Okay. Well, I just would ask the chairman, let's have a debate on the budget and vote on it, and I think that'd be good for the country. Are you in the chain of command or decision-making process regarding changing Title 42 deportation policies?
I certainly keep up with the policy discussions. I also know, and I know you know, that Title 42 has also been brought up in the courts. So this might be decided by the judicial branch on how to deal with Title 42 at the border. But I am a part of discussions because there are budgetary consequences.
Right. So let's set the courts aside for a moment because we can't deal with that. Is there a movement in the Biden administration to change Title 42 policies?
Senator Graham, you know any decisions or conversations we have with the president?
Well, I mean, I read about it in the paper.
Yeah, I won't discuss anything decisional we talk to the president about, but what I will point to is in this budget, there's a 5% increase for the Department of Homeland Security, including additional agents. Look, we have a pattern of migration, and we are preparing to ramp up for a traditional pattern of additional people coming across the border.
My question is, well, do you support eliminating Title 42 deportation authority?
I don't have a personal opinion. I believe we, from a resource position, are putting forth enough money to deal with a historic pattern.
Do you believe our border is more secure today than it was 2 years ago?
Senator, I strongly believe that we are putting forward a proposal that does more than a physical infrastructure. I believe there's bipartisan support for the technology options we're putting forward, and we ask you to take a close look at that.
Do you believe things are going well here at home and abroad?
I believe I read out some statistics. I'll revisit the strongest economic growth in 40 years last year.
Yeah, I would just say, with all due respect, things are not going well here at home and abroad. And policies do matter. And I think the explosion you see at the border is about to get worse if we repeal Title 42 authority. On the defense side, do you think this is a dangerous world, getting increasingly more dangerous?
You and I have talked about this. It absolutely is, and gotten worse with the Russian aggression since we last talked.
Yeah. So in this budget, we'll be spending 2.4% GDP on defense in the next decade, at the end of the next decade. Given the threats we face, does that make sense?
If you allow me to be a little wonky here, we do budgets 10 years. You require that of us. Defense usually plans on a 5-year basis, a future year's defense budget. So we absolutely do ramp up in accordance with that. And the rest of the 5 years is mechanical, and I'm sure we'll revisit that in future years.
Yeah, and I have a lot of respect for you, and I think I voted for you enthusiastically, but not being wonky, this budget puts us on a path to spend less on defense, GDP-wise, in the modern history of America. And we're going to spend more on domestic spending at a time when the world is literally coming apart. China's developing hypersonic missile capability. Their military is growing by leaps and bounds. You've seen what's happened in Ukraine, and I think Putin's not going to stop there unless somebody stops him. The Iranian nuclear threat's going to reemerge again. So I would just say on the defense side, this budget has got it all wrong. That's just my opinion. On inflation, how much of inflation increases are driven by energy cost?
It is a fair amount, and it has increased since Russian aggression.
Yeah. In this budget, you eliminate tax advantages for oil and gas companies when it comes to exploring for American-owned oil and gas. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. Are you aware of the calls by President Biden to get OPEC to produce more oil?
Senator, not in my lane.
Yeah, well, apparently he has called for, we're talking to Venezuela, we're talking to Saudi Arabia, we're even entertaining having Iran produce more oil and gas, and we're going out of the oil and gas business here. While I believe climate change is real, I think this budget would make the problems at the pump enormously worse. And I would like to urge the chairman to bring the budget to the floor, dedicate some time, and let's talk about it and vote on it. Thank you very much.
And thank you for staying within the 5 minutes, and I will ask everybody to do the same. You're right on time. Senator Murray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Director Young, good to see you. Thank you for joining us and for all the work that you and your staff went into delivering this really strong budget. I was really pleased to see President's budget lay out a plan that would lower costs for Washington State families and prioritize important investments that will help our communities succeed in the present and in the future, all by asking for giant corporations and the wealthiest to pay their fair share. Now, we have made solid progress, as you outlined, in rebuilding our economy from the pandemic, including the historic job growth. But it's clear when I listen to people back in Washington State that we have a lot more work to do, and the status quo isn't working for working families, which is why Democrats have put forward really bold solutions as part of our reconciliation package, including our plans on child care and pre-K. I wanted to ask you, both as a new mom and as the nation's budget official, can you speak to how the Democrats' child care plan, which is fully paid for, would lower costs for families?
One is the president put forward last year, Senator, and does this year. We believe to be fiscally responsible, we should pay for our proposals. We do that, and you've laid out how. We also believe that one way to deal with inflationary pressures is to deal with pocketbook issues, including child care. Many families pay an exorbitant amount of their percentage of income just to take care of their child, and it is, we believe, one of the barriers to bringing women back into the workforce. So our proposal says families should not pay more than 7% of their income on child care costs.
I appreciate that and totally agree. And I think that proposal is absolutely critical to helping people get back into the economy, working again, and raising the economy for everyone. This budget includes a lot of other important investments, from sustained public health and preparedness funding, putting us on a path to doubling the maximum Pell Grant to support students, to a strong infusion of funds to support critical family planning work and boosting the supply of affordable housing. I want to make clear how important I believe it is for Congress to prioritize making those types of investments and to also start working on completing the fiscal year 2023 bills right away. I'm sure you agree. Finally, I just want to raise a couple of critical issues for my state, and I've raised these with you before. First, on the Hanford side, I'm extremely disappointed again this budget would roll back the really important progress we've made to advance cleanup at Hanford. The proposed funding cuts in this budget would be totally unproductive, delaying the cleanup mission even further. I will be working to build upon the investments we made in the 22 omnibus. I hope the administration will partner with me on that effort.
And Senator Murray, that is the reduction is a point of timing. The omnibus was finished recently. We absolutely want to work with you to at least maintain the levels secured in the omnibus.
This is really critical funding, so I hope we can continue this discussion. And before I close, salmon recovery. I was really pleased to see in the budget strong funding for NOAA and continued funding for direct recovery and habitat restoration, including the Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Fund. Saving our salmon is absolutely essential to Washington State's economy and to our cultural heritage. It's really an urgent undertaking. So I look forward to working closely with you on that as we make sure that the federal government is doing its part.
I happened to work for a Washington Stater for 2 years.
I do remember that, yes.
And have visited up and down the Puget Sound, and I understand the importance to the citizens of Washington State, especially our tribal partners. And you have a ally in me in ensuring salmon recovery in the Northwest.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Murray. Senator Grassley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations on your appointment. The president has touted his budget as fiscally responsible. It is not responsible. He attempts to take credit for cutting this year's deficit by $1 3 trillion. That is mainly the product of pandemic-era spending coming to an end. In fact, most of this so-called deficit reduction results from the president and majority in Congress going on a $2 trillion liberal wish list spending spree, stoking the flames of inflation. So in the end, then, taking credit for deficit reduction resulting from discontinuation of irresponsible spending is comparable to an arsonist taking credit for containing a fire by refraining from dousing it with more gasoline. Even worse, the only reason the president and majority haven't thrown more gasoline on the flames of inflation is because people like Manchin and Sinema had had enough and refused to go along. If the president and most of his party had their way, this year's deficit and future year deficits would be hundreds of billions of dollars higher. Notably, the president's reckless tax and spending spree, which Democrats spent all of last year working to pass, is just a footnote in this budget. Yet, even assuming the reckless tax and spending spree isn't going anywhere, the president's budget still includes unprecedented levels of spending, of tax hikes, and deficit and debt. Under the president's budget, spending would average 23.4% of our economy over the next 10 years. Historically, this is a level of spending previously only seen for brief periods in response to a recession or a national emergency or war. Moreover, his budget includes $2.5 trillion of tax increases that I think is going to be a job killer. Despite record levels of tax hikes, the budget fails to balance or even pay our debt or deficit on a sustainable path. Our annual deficit, the amount that we would spend each year beyond what we take in as revenue, would exceed $1 trillion in each of the next 10 years and reaches $1.8 trillion in 2032. Moreover, our public national debt climbs to 106.7% of our economy, which would be the highest recorded level of debt in our nation's history. So while the president provides lip service to fiscal responsibility, his budget is the same old tired liberal tax and spend agenda with red ink as far as the eyes can see. Director Young, the president has touted his budget as reducing the deficit by $1 trillion. However, his budget does not account for any of the spending or tax hikes in his so-called Build Back Better plan. Instead, it establishes a reserve fund for its enactment on a deficit-neutral basis. From this, is it safe for me to assume the administration would oppose then any revised version of Build Back Better plan that CBO does not score as deficit neutral?
Senator Grassley, thank you for that. We are putting forth goals for legislation the president still calls on. It needs to reduce costs for the American people. It needs to expand the productive capacity of our economy. And it needs to reduce the deficit. We're holding enough revenue, we believe, to do a version of the proposal as Congress works on the legislation. But what you see here in the budget is an effort not to get into in front of those negotiations. But we believe it's fiscally responsible to hold enough revenues to allow those conversations to happen.
So yes, it would, if such a plan, revised plan comes out, it's yes, that it would have to be budget neutral.
At least budget neutral, and the president's personal goal is that it be deficit reducing.
Okay, my last question will have to be this. I've got 18 seconds. Even without inclusion of any spending or tax increases from Build Back Better, government spending and revenue are projected to be at a near record high under the president's budget. Is the president still going to push for a revised version of Build Back Better to be enacted? If so, how much more spending and tax can the American people expect? Is it a trillion or more, 2 trillion more, et cetera?
Senator Grassley, the president remains committed to a bill that reduces child care, health care, energy costs, but he does believe it should be paid for through tax reform.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Stabenow.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Young, it's wonderful to see you again. So appreciate all of your hard work. And And I very much support the budget that the president has put forward. We'd be happy to vote on it, so appreciate it. Let me first start, though, by saying that just like President Obama inherited the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression and had to dig our country out of it, President Biden inherited a mess. He inherited a mess. Over 424,000 people died of COVID before he was even sworn in. And if there had been competent, responsible actions by the Trump administration at the very beginning, this would be a very different story for Americans. President Biden also inherited a $7 trillion increase in our nation's debt from just 4 years in the Trump administration. And he inherited a global economic shutdown that we have not seen in our lifetime that has led to supply chain breakdowns and prices rising. And as horrible as it is to see the inflation we have, I am not surprised, Mr. Chairman, to see when we're trying to get the economy going again, that this has happened. And I appreciate all the efforts on supply chains to get things up and going again, and our focus as a caucus to bring down costs. The president's budget builds on the strongest economy in decades, as you said, by making investments that will help create jobs, will lower costs for people, and reduce our deficit. So I believe this budget is worth celebrating. But unfortunately, I know Republican colleagues, as today, Mr. Chairman, will demonize the budget. So I think it's important to look at what the alternative budget proposal is that they will support from the Republican side. So our Republican colleague, Rick Scott, who is on the Senate Budget Committee, a member of the Republican leadership, has offered us with key pieces of a Republican budget. What would they do if they were in the majority? So under their plan, all federal laws sunset in 5 years. And of course, if you think about it, the implications of that are shocking. I mean, that would mean an end to Medicare and Social Security, an end to Medicaid, which provides health care coverage for 86 million Americans, including our seniors in nursing homes. It'd mean the end of the Veterans Administration, taking away all the health care and other support for people who served our country. Under this Republican plan, middle-class families would see their taxes go up $100 billion this year alone. In Michigan, 38% of my constituents would see a tax increase. And there's so much more in here. I could go on and on. You know, President Biden has a great expression that I think is fitting for today. He says, "Show me your budget and I'll show you what you value." And through his budget request, we know President Biden's values and Democratic values and who we're fighting for. And thanks to Senator Rick Scott, the head of the Senate Republican Campaign Committee, we also know what Republican colleagues value. So let me now turn to the specifics in the budget. This president has proposed the largest increase in support for mental health and addiction services ever since President Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act in 1963, which was his last official bill signing. And so I want to say thank you to him through you. Thank you for working with me. Thank you for working with Senator Blunt and I on our bipartisan efforts to expand community behavioral health clinics across the country, evidence-based, bipartisan efforts now being fully implemented in 10 states. And I want to thank you for expanding this across the country. It's so needed, and certainly COVID has shown us the incredible needs that families have. So, Ms. Young, could you talk more about why the budget proposes a nationwide expansion of this bipartisan program?
You have 30 seconds to do it.
With 30 seconds, I want to thank Senator Stabenow, Senator Blunt for their tireless efforts to address what really is a crisis, the mental health crisis. The budget proposes reforms to health coverage I spoke about earlier and makes major investments to the mental health workforce. This comprehensive set of proposals will improve access to mental health treatment and strengthen the mental health provider workforce to respond to what is absolutely a crisis.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Senator Toomey. Is Senator Toomey here virtually? All right, Senator, I have on the Republican side, Senator Scott next. Senator Romney. All right, in that case, Senator Romney.
Thank you, Director. Appreciate your being here. I know you want my mic's going on, so I'll touch that button, but I'm going to come over to this point. This is a slide. I don't know whether you've seen this, Mr. Chairman. I'm sure you have and other members have. This shows the debt held by the public. It's not total debt. This is debt held by the public in our country. Historically, going back to 1900 and where we are today. And we're approximately, the debt held by the public is approximately 100% of the GDP of the country. The last two countries that got into real trouble and had a almost collapse of their currency and their debt were Greece and Italy. Greece reached almost the same number, about 105, and Italy about 108 or 9, and percent of GDP. If you look at the budget that you've provided to us, you take us to 200% debt as a percentage of the GDP. Now, I don't know what you all believe that does. I'm just going to make sure the chairman also gets a chance to see that, which is that here's the level of debt that Italy had. Greece had, they got into financial distress. We're at 100% of GDP right now. According to this budget, we get to 200% of the GDP of our debt held by the public. Now, I'm a financial guy, and I know that if something like that happens, there will be economic calamity. People will stop loaning money to the United States. Interest rates will go through the roof. We're not talking about going up to 2, 3, 4, 5%. We're going up to like what happened in Greece and Italy. So at some point, there's a dramatic departure from what we've all experienced. I don't know what that point is. I ask financial people who really are more financial than myself, where does it happen? When is it that we hit the cliff? Do you have a sense of what level of debt you just can't go beyond as a percentage of GDP, debt held by the public? Do you have a sense of what that is?
And Senator, if I can, what I have is the percentage of GDP is about 106% in the 2032. So I just wanted to start with the difference in effect here.
This goes out to 2050.
Our budget goes to 2032.
Yeah, and the CBO takes it all the way out.
We believe the way to look at debt is what it costs to service the debt. We believe that remains at a historic low rate and doesn't crowd out other investments, so we don't end up in the same situation you saw in other countries.
I see. So you just look at how much it costs, and if the interest rates are low, to service the debt. So what would you have said to every other country that's gotten to this level that's had an economic collapse? That they were just wrong? See, what happens is when people are afraid you can't pay back the debt because of how high it is as a percentage of your economy, they start asking for a higher interest rate. And when they do so, the amount you're having to spend to service the debt gets to be backbreaking. Every major civilization that's gone down this path has ended up having their currency no longer become the reserve currency of the world and have economic collapse. We simply cannot continue on a road of adding $1 trillion of debt every year. Let me look at the other slide. It's probably behind me. Oh, there it is. My colleague is behind me. I'm just looking at, every single year in your 10-year forecast, you're showing deficits of over $1 trillion a year. I don't know how, when the economy is doing well, we can keep adding $1 trillion a year to the debt without at some point reaching calamity. And so does the administration have a plan to deal with this? Is there some way we can stop these $1 trillion annual deficits and putting us on a road to financial distress?
Senator, we're doing it. $1.3 trillion in deficit reduction this year.
Well, I'm sorry. The Democrats passed a massive COVID bill. COVID was an extraordinary event, and we passed a lot of money to help people through that. Is there any reduction in spending that the administration has proposed, other than COVID spending, in this new budget?
COVID spending costs just as any other spending. And this president, had he not done ARP, many economists, including Moody's, who I sat with 2 days ago, believe we'd be in a double-dip recession.
I'm all in favor of COVID spending. I think ARP and the amount of money that was sent to states when states didn't need it. I mean, I think these numbers just roundabout. California had a $60 billion surplus last year, and ARP sent them $40 billion more. And the waste in ARP, as well as other programs, is unbelievable. But I know my time is up. I make the point that if you look at what you're doing over this budget, you're seeing that all of the increases in mandatory programs, the massive increases in mandatory programs, and if we're ever going to get a handle on our debt, we're going to have to find a way to either increase revenue, which I don't favor, or find a way to adjust our long-term benefits, not for current retirees, but for young people coming along. We got to be able to find a way to balance these programs, or we're going to find ourselves in a heap of trouble.
And Mr. Chairman, if I could say,
Senator Whitehouse.
Yep.
Thank you, Chairman. On the continuing subject of economic calamity, and with respect to climate change, have most of the world's major central banks warned about a carbon bubble that could burst and damage the world economy?
You and I have talked about this. I believe around 18% retraction is an estimate out there that would be catastrophic to economies.
And separately, have Freddie Mac, the big American mortgage company, and others warned of a coastal property values crash related to climate and sea level rise that would cascade through the entire national economy.
Senator, I know you know this more than anyone given the state you're from, but it is an absolute crisis waiting to happen.
And are those not both the sort of economic crises that come on suddenly with a sudden collapse? It's the nature of bubbles and crashes when things go wrong that it happens catastrophically and dramatically, is it not?
That is correct, but we do know it's coming, which is why we have to do something about it.
Precisely. Thank you for making that a point in this hearing. With respect to mental health, does the administration agree that children's mental health and addiction-related mental health issues, recovery, and police encounters with individuals involved in mental health crises are three important places to focus new investment in mental health?
Thank you for asking that. The mental health proposal does many things. It not only is the right thing to do for those suffering from mental health issues, but it helps in our community violence issues, and it also helps with our addiction issues. So there are many reasons to make major investments.
With respect to the billionaire minimum income tax, I would just like to propose to you that you keep your mind open to the prospect of the so-called Buffett rule, supplementing the billionaire's minimum tax. It has very broad support, and it relates to people who it starts when you're making over $1 million a year, and it kicks in fully when you're making $3 million a year, and it's, again, a basic minimum tax to make sure that people who have those kind of resources aren't paying a lot of lawyers and lobbyists and tax advisors to end up paying lower tax rates than firefighters, and nurses, and teachers.
We will absolutely keep that in mind.
And my last point, again, coming from Rhode Island, and speaking on behalf, I think, of many coastal states, we've discussed this already, but the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has a very significant account that is called its Inland and Coastal Spending Account. And it has run an average of $1.36 billion for inland projects, compared to $113 million for coastal projects. So for every dollar that this fund sends to inland flooding projects, it has only a penny or less available for coastal flooding projects. And this is obviously a matter of great concern, not just to Rhode Island, but to coastal states everywhere. I think our friends from Louisiana are seeing the highest rate of coastal loss and erosion of any state in the country. And the fixation of the Army Corps only on inland flooding, with sea level rise and storm surge making the risk to coastal communities so much worse, is something that I would urge this administration to address. It is not addressed in this budget. I think as a policy matter, we need to figure out how to get more revenues to coastal communities to deal with the threats that they're looking at that a decade ago, 20 years ago, people would have thought were unfathomable, but are now so real that entities like Moody's are baking that into their rating for communities' debt.
And Senator, I've told you privately, I will tell you publicly, we will talk to Army Corps about this, but also you have my commitment to talking to and working with the Appropriations Committee. The budget is the beginning of the process, so we have a long way to go before this is enacted into law.
Dollars for inland compared to pennies for coastal does not seem fair. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The President's budget message to Congress states, and I quote, "Critically, my budget would also keep our nation on a sound fiscal course," end quote. But that's just flat out false. Our nation is not on a sound fiscal course. It hasn't been for quite some time. But after reviewing this budget request, it's clear to me that the President's budget would worsen our nation's fiscal health. The Biden budget proposes $72.7 trillion of total spending and $58.3 trillion of total revenue over the next 10 years. That results in $14.4 trillion of total deficits. Publicly held debt balloons in this budget from over $23 trillion currently to $40 trillion by 2032. And that assumes no recession, no unforeseen emergency spendings like the trillions in COVID relief from 2020. But if you want to really gauge whether this budget actually restores fiscal sanity, we ought to compare it to current law, at least for a starting point. Specifically, the CBO's July 21 budget baseline is a good place to start. Let's look at total deficits from a comparable time period, 22 to 23 in the Biden budget versus what is projected under current law. So under current law, CBO says that the cumulative deficit over this period of time will be $12.1 trillion. The Biden budget calls for $14.1 trillion. So how does making the 10-year budget deficit window worse by $2 trillion, despite huge tax increases, how does that put us on a stable or sustainable path? President Biden's boastful claim about reducing the 21 and 22 deficits compared to 2020 is completely disingenuous and totally context-free. In 2020, Congress passed 5 bills to respond to the public health and economic crisis posed by COVID. The unprecedented emergency spending of those bills resulted in $3.1 trillion of budget deficit for 2020 alone. Of course, it's important to remember that money was intended to be spent in 2020. Then the Democrats come along and pass a bill in March 21 full of partisan policy priorities, almost completely unrelated to COVID, and they add $2 trillion to our deficits at a time when there was no economic justification, no need for that massive spending. And now our Democratic colleagues brag about the 21 deficit being lower than 2020, but completely omit that their partisan bill actually made the 21 deficit $1.2 trillion worse than it otherwise would have been, and that bill has subsequently proven to be a significant contributor to the 40-year high inflation that our country is experiencing. The decline from 2020's record high deficit should be attributed to the expiration of the extraordinary, unprecedented spending that was in response to COVID. And there are plenty of other reasons to reject the claim that this budget is somehow fiscally responsible. It calls for a 14% year-over-year increase in non-defense. This big, massive increase in the federal bureaucracy and the welfare state, well beyond even current inflation. Meanwhile, the budget calls for an inflation-adjusted cut to our defense budget. Budget calls for only a 4% nominal increase in spending, which is an unrealistic and dangerous level considering inflation running much higher than that and a very dangerous situation around the world that we're reminded of continuously. It also, of course, proposes nothing at all to address the looming insolvency and the generally unsustainable growth of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which now account for 50% of total spending. Also hides the true cost, yet again, of the various tax and spend proposals featured in the so-called Build Back Better plan, some version of which is still contemplated by the administration. So, Director Young, let me ask you a couple of questions about tax hikes, because there's a lot of tax hikes proposed in this bill. Do you know what percentage of the country's total income the top 1% of wage earners earn, approximately?
Senator, we know that, for example,
I got almost no time. Do you know the answer to that question? It's a very specific question.
I think the specific thing we'd like to highlight is that 400 of the richest people in this country are worth more than $150 million.
Okay, I know you've got lots of talking points, but I did ask a specific question. Since you refused to answer it, I'll answer it. The top 1% of wage earners earn about 20% of all the earned income in America. You know what percentage of the total federal income tax burden that those same people pay?
We know what percentage of their income they pay, and it's
so the answer is 40. So the answer is 40%. So the top 1% make about 20% of all the income, pay about 40% of all the taxes, and you and the president's budget say that that's not their fair share. Their fair share must be much higher. So, Mr. Chairman, my point in this is, I'm quite sure that we won't hear what the fair share would be if paying twice the proportion of the income earned isn't a fair share. And it makes middle-class Americans wonder just what kind of tax increase you're going to hit them with to make them pay their so-called fair share.
I would just remind Senator Toomey that most of the billionaires in this country do not earn wages. They make their money elsewhere. Senator Warner.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as someone who probably falls into
Make it a little bit louder if you could, Mark.
Sure. As someone who had been blessed and lucky enough to fall into that 1%, I think I am paying a fair share, but I agree with the chairman. And the truth is, our system allows massive amounts of wealth accumulation, and we've seen it dramatically during COVID. And we've got to find a way that some of the wealthiest Americans in our country do pay their fair share. And I believe the focus of some of the president's proposals are not even actually on the 1%, but the 10th of 1%. And I think the numbers there in terms of share of wealth and amount of taxes paid, unfortunately, are pretty dramatically different. Director Young, first of all, it's great to call you director, not acting director, and appreciate the very important work you've done. I want to get to two questions during my time. We all know that one of the things that's driving inflation is a shortage of housing supply. Home prices, we know, have more than doubled. Rents are up about 14%. But we know there are still enormous amount, particularly on low and moderate and particularly low income housing, enormous amounts of shortages in this area. It's one of the reasons why on the banking committee, where I work with Senator Toomey and Senator Brown and others, we've looked at this issue. I was glad to see in the president's budget that you took on the issue of affordable housing supply, and obviously we'll be discussing this with HUD. But can you tell me a little bit more, Director Young, about the administration's proposal here on housing supply, particularly for low-income Americans?
Thank you, Senator Warner, and I know you've worked hard on this issue. What we found is we'd often put proposals that dealt with the demand side, vouchers, and we'd often, look at the statistics. The vouchers weren't used. What we really have in this country is a supply issue of affordable housing. This bill would invest $50 billion through direct spending, incentives to state and locals to improve many of the barriers there are to building affordable housing, and also a tax credit system that would encourage the building of affordable housing.
Well, I appreciate that and look forward to working with you and HUD on this issue. I want to take my last 2 minutes and go at an issue that's also near and dear to my heart, but kind of nerdy, and that is questions around the Technology Modernization Fund. I think if we look back at, frankly, working with Secretary Mnuchin, where we had to be very creative, and actually the chairman and I had, I think, a better plan on income replacement during COVID that would have been fairer and more balanced. And it's not often that the chairman and I find such complete agreement, but Instead, we ended up with a fairly blunt instrument put forward by the Trump administration of a $400 a week plus up on uninsurance. And it was arbitrary, and a lot of that was due to the fact that we didn't have the technology to be able to do the kind of income replacement that some of our European partners did instead. We continue to underinvest, and I think the administration has moved forward a bit on technology modernization fund. I hope we could add more to this. If we're going to make federal government more efficient, more transparent, and hit to the goals of following the money, we're going to need a IT systems that match 21st century. IRS is a classic example. We've talked about that a lot. But can you talk a little bit? We made some progress in the American Rescue Plan, but can you talk about the IT and technology modernization needs that you have to oversee from OMB?
So quickly, the TMF, we were oversubscribed. The ARP provided $1 billion. We received about $2 billion in applications from agencies who are in desperate, dire need of technology upgrades. The government is not keeping up. It makes us less safe to foreign actors, including some terrible breaches we've seen in the recent past. Also, we're not providing the services that the American people deserve.
Well, I appreciate that. And again, the chairman and I worked on, I thought, a more direct plan to help Americans. I hope we can still put some of those plans in place going forward. So if we ever have the kind of crisis we had around a COVID type experience, we have a more efficient system in place. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ironically, it was right after I got here, Senator Warner and I had a discussion about what is that level of government spending at the federal level that would be acceptable to his side of the aisle. He always referred to the Europeans. I want to cite a couple statistics. On our revenue side, if you go back 50 years, we average 17 to 18% of our GDP. High rates, we have lower economic growth. Low rates, like pre-COVID through the Trump tax cuts, we had better economic growth. But it's almost immutable that we're there. This budget, I think, is at 25% of current GDP. I mean, that's a quantum leap, even above the European model. And you've got record taxes embedded into it as well. And I got several questions for you, so please keep them as short as you can. Do you have an ideal rate that you'd like to see the federal government as a percentage of our GDP?
Revenues or debt?
Spending.
We believe as long as you are putting forward proposals to pay for that spending, we shouldn't look at the percentage of GDP, but you should pay for your proposals.
So you're willing to go to a European level of where government would get that much larger and try to force the system to pay a tax rate that it's never been able to do in past history to support it?
We believe we should invest in the American people. As a percent of GDP, non-defense, we talked about a lot, remains below the historic GDP level.
And I think we all do too. It's just that you can't do it on this paradigm. It goes broke in the long run. Do you know what interest rates were roughly back in 1978, say for a home mortgage?
I was one, so you'll excuse me if I don't remember that.
You wouldn't remember it. That's true. I'll tell you, it was 10%. And early into the 80s, they got up to right under 20%, and that was due to the evil that's been unleashed, inflation currently. It took interest rates into that level to get inflation back to where you take the tax that robs everyone back in order. That is something that we need to be concerned about because currently we're at 8%, and even pre-COVID, we were at 2.5%. It was stable, and that's something we need to be worried about. Where do you think when it comes to the size of the, not the revenue side, which we've talked about, on spending, do you think that it needs to be reprioritized in any way? Because currently this budget is calling for, I think, a 14% increase on domestic spending, only 4% on defense.
Thank you so much.
It seems out of proportion.
Thank you for that. I'll remind everyone the non-defense side includes our commitment to our veterans, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security. There are absolutely critical security, the State Department, critical security elements in the non-defense side.
So I think then, with the short amount of time we have left, it comes back to the theme of what I think Senator Romney was talking about and many. For as many people in my short time here that come to the federal government expect it to have its house in order. And when you're proposing something that would go way beyond, I think, what most other senators on the other side of the aisle would think that is sustainable, a federal government, 25% of our GDP, how do you think we can do that, be there for all the people that do look to it, when you got like the Medicare Trust Fund that completely goes bust here in 4.5 years? Social Security, which we've actuarially known, the same thing, paying into since the Depression era, here in about 11 years. How does that all work out to where any of this will be there for the people that need it the most down the road?
Senator, we may disagree on how the president wants to pay for his proposals, but he believed the way to deal with this is to invest in the American people while also asking the wealthiest in corporations, many of who don't pay any tax in 2020, to pay at least what firefighters, nurses, and teachers pay as a part of their tax income.
So, in summary, then, I think it looks like he thinks the solution long-term is to change our economy into one driven by the federal government that's going to be larger than even the European economies that at least balance their budgets. And you're going in the face of historical data that we're the unique system where we generate the most prosperity of any country, and there's no arguing about it. It needs to be looked at who's benefiting from it. Would share a lot of ideas, I think, that would be similar in terms of trying to make that more broadly felt. It runs the system into the ditch in the long run because it defies history and that you'll never be able to pay for it. And to me, that's a bad plan. Thank you.
Director Young, good to have you with us. Congratulations on your recent confirmation. I want to highlight some points that you made in your opening, but that I think bear repeating. Current trends. Jobs are booming. When the president was inaugurated, unemployment was at 6.4%. Today, it's 3.8%. More than 7 million jobs have been created in 13 months. Number two, the economy overall is growing. Our economy grew by more than 5.5% from the end of 2020 through the end of 2021. The best year for growth in the last 4 decades in America, and we have strong opportunities in 2022 as well. Workers are taking advantage of tight labor markets to switch jobs and getting raises. Wages are growing faster than they have in years, and in particular, wages for many people who work in some of our lower paid sectors have done particularly well. So these are 3 very, very strong economic trends. I don't hear enough discussion of them, but that just means we need to talk about them more. There is a 4th trend that is troubling, and that's the inflation trend. We are seeing higher inflation than we have. It's often connected to an economy that got constricted pretty significantly and supply chains that got disrupted during COVID. The economy is coming back with strong demand, and the supply hasn't completely caught up to it. And so those disruptions are a significant reason for inflation. But I guess what I want to applaud you for is I think you put a budget on the table that tries to take advantage of the 3 strong trends and accelerate them, but also offers us some thoughts about how we can deal with the 4th trend. So on that issue of inflation, the challenge that we're grappling with, is inflation a problem that's unique to the United States right now?
It's absolutely a global trend. The pandemic was a global issue. We see most countries coming out of the pandemic with the same inflationary pressures.
What are the key features of the president's budget to try to help deal with inflation, or in particular, just pocketbook costs that Americans are experiencing both kind of in the near term and then down the road? And
I want to remind everyone that the Fed really, in the wisdom of our system, put monetary policy outside the political process. So they really have a lot of the tools in which to deal with inflationary pressures, and they're using them. This president believes in ensuring he does not interfere with the Fed decisions. But what we are trying to do from the administration, we're asking you to take a look at, is improve our supply chain issues. We've seen the issues around the ports in this country where ships are backed up. That is why, thank you for the infrastructure bill. We are putting resources into our port systems. We are also working to get more truckers on the road. We have an issue driving things to stores. That is increasing inflationary pressures. We're also investing in the FTC and Department of Justice antitrust offices to ensure there's competition in this country. We believe lack of competition raises prices. So those are the things we are asking you to take a look at as part of this budget to deal with inflation. And one more, sir. The president continues to call on Congress to send him a bill that lowers costs for Americans, lowers child care costs, lowers health costs, lowers energy costs.
If we can lower child care costs, if we can lower costs of prescription drugs, if we can lower health care premiums, I mean, these are three of the big ticket items that take a bite out of people's pocketbooks. We need to do that, and I'm very committed to working with my colleagues together to do it. Last issue I'll ask you about, Director Young, is mental health investments and also criminal justice investments. I had a series of meetings last week with communities in Southwest Virginia that have really suffered with gun violence issues. You know, it's a point of sadness for me that after having dealt with a lot of gun violence issues as a mayor and then as a governor, we've not been able to do anything credible on gun safety during the time that I have been in the Senate. It's my hope that we will. But setting that aside, talk a little bit about some of the criminal justice investments that this budget would make to help us deal with crime issues, but also the mental health investments that the budget would propose as we're dealing with the aftermath of two very difficult years for most Americans.
Thank you, Senator Kaine. And the president made clear in his State of the Union, he believes the police are a key to dealing with our violence issues in our communities, but he also believes they need to be community-oriented, deep into the communities. This budget invests $2.3 billion, a 32% increase for the Department of Justice over 2021 to address gun violence. We also invest $1.7 billion, almost $250 million increase for ATF to follow the guns. Guns often end up in the hands of criminals. So this budget also believes we're putting forth an initiative for community violence reduction, not just DOJ, but HHS. We need those wraparound services. And I think you've heard us talk about our big mental health push to ensure that mental health coverage is treated the same way as physical coverage. All those things are interrelated.
Thank you, Director Young. I'll next call on Senator Scott and return the chair to the chair.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Director Young.
Good morning.
You see the number behind me, the budget, $5.8 trillion. Do you have any idea what the budget was by chance 20 years ago?
I don't.
It was $1.4 trillion 20 years ago. So how much do you think the population has increased in 20 years? What's your guess?
Percentage-wise, 20%.
Yeah, 16. So think about this. Our budget is up fourfold, and population's only going up by 16%. How does that make any sense?
Senator, I think many people will tell you, included in that number, the bulk of that number is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. We have structural issues in this country, including the aging of our population. And you're right, the president is not putting forth a proposal that would cut those benefits. He's not going to do that.
So how do you think it's sustainable that we can, how can you, I mean, fourfold with the population increase, and in your budget, population is increasing last year 0.1%, and your budget's up 7.4% overall. I mean, how, I mean, when do we not just stop working?
Senator, this budget is fully paid for. I understand if you disagree with the way the president pays for it through taxing the wealthiest and corporations, but he's paying for the investments in this budget.
The numbers are staggering. I mean,
most of the increases because of our entitlement programs. And you're right, the president is not going to put forth a budget that cuts those benefits.
So what's CPI now?
CPI is close to 7%.
Yeah, 7.9%, and producer price index 10%. All right, so in your budget, you think that within a few months it's going to go down to 2.9%. Well, do you have data that would just suggest it's going to go down to 2.9% like that?
No,
it's gone up every month that President Biden's been in office. the inflation has increased. It's not gone down.
Yeah,
It's increased.
you're absolutely right. And what I was going to say is, to get a budget to you to start this lovely dialogue, we locked those inflation and interest rates numbers in November, and inflation has absolutely changed since that happened. Our long-term forecasts, however, do remain in line with private forecasters.
So what's going to change? What are you doing as an example? Probably the biggest problem we've got now is energy prices. What in this budget is going to get energy prices down? And if energy prices don't come down, we can't get inflation down, period.
Yeah, one, I'll remind everyone, energy prices at the pump are market driven. We are a capitalist society. The market decides the amount. It has gone up by $1 since Russian aggression. The president has called on oil and gas companies to ensure that they are pricing things fairly.
Just put in perspective, it went up before the invasion too.
But $1 cents.
It went up over $1 before the invasion. So I mean, it wasn't caused because of the inflation or invasion. So let's go to you talked about the Federal Reserve. All right, the Federal Reserve has indicated it's going to raise interest rates this year. All right, and so if they're going to increase interest rates this year, what's the duration of the federal debt right now? Do you know?
We've talked a lot about that. We don't typically use that term in budget and economy. That I believe you're referring to how long it pays off the debt. That has as much to do with the policies made in this Congress as anything else. So I don't think that's a phrase that many of us use in budget terms.
We use it in budget in Florida. We used it. How long is our debt out? So we locked in our debt so we could lock in our interest rates. And my understanding is under your budget, you don't lock in interest rates. And so you're subject to this increase that the Federal Reserve is going to do in interest rates this year. Is that not right?
Well, as a reminder, the federal government is different than state governments. We can carry debt. We budget very differently than state budgets.
But you could lock it in. You could lock in it. You could lock in duration of your debt, so you knew exactly what interest expense was going to be. And you decide not to do it because short-term rates right now are a little bit lower than long-term rates. But what are you going to do when interest rates go up? I mean, how are you going to pay for this?
You'll be happy to know our budget actually does include an assumption that interest rates go up.
Not by much.
In line with private forecasters.
So we've got $30 trillion worth of debt, and you're projecting another $14 trillion worth of debt. What's the max? I mean, is it what? I mean, you're taking it to almost $45 trillion in the next 10 years. What do you think? When does this end? When can we not pay this anymore?
Again, the bulk of this is entitlements, and you're right. The president is not putting forward a proposal to cut those, and we believe the debt is manageable as long as the cost to service it is.
You're the O&B director. You have to fix these things. You can't just say it's not going to matter. You have to fix it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Director, for your testimony. Congratulations on your bipartisan confirmation vote. And thank you for working with the President to put forward a budget that will help grow our economy, but do it in a way that's more inclusive, so we have greater prosperity and greater shared prosperity. And I just want to emphasize a couple points in the budget that have been covered already, but I think they bear repeating. First of all, the initiative to reduce the cost of prescription drugs. The senator from Florida was talking about how we can make some savings in some of these programs. We could save the Medicare system money by giving Medicare the ability to negotiate the price of prescription drugs. Isn't that true?
Some estimates are $600 billion, as high as $800 billion in savings.
Right. So this is a win-win, right? We can reduce the cost of prescription drugs for American consumers, and we can save money in Medicare.
Correct.
I also applaud the provisions in the budget to reduce the cost of quality child care. This is something that is hitting every American family. We need to get on top of this. We have proposals that we presented here in the Congress. Unfortunately, our Republican colleagues have not joined us in supporting those measures. If they did, we could get this done right away. I also, continue to listen to my Republican colleagues on the deficit issue. And at the same time they talk about the deficit, they're opposing the measures in this budget to increase revenue by asking the biggest multinational corporations to pay more by closing international tax loopholes. Isn't that how you do it in the budget?
That is correct.
And don't you ask billionaires and very wealthy people to contribute more to the country?
Correct.
Right. So, people want to have this both ways. I was here in this committee when Republicans passed a $2 trillion tax cut, mostly for the very wealthy and big corporations, that increased our deficit. And now today, I hear complaints about the deficit, but opposition to provisions to raise funds by asking the very wealthy to pay a little bit more. I want to also commend you, especially with respect to some of the education investments in this budget. One of the things I've tried to do for many, many years was to have full funding for our schools, especially our neediest schools, through Title I. And in this budget, I think you would double the allotment for Title I compared to what we just passed to the omnibus. Is that correct?
We go a little further. We asked for about $19 billion more between discretionary and mandatory. But I want to thank you and everyone else for the $1 billion investment in Title I. We had not seen that level of increase since I've worked on that program for many years. So thank you.
Well, thank you for pushing that and the President. We've got to do even more, and I applaud you for putting some mandatory funding in. I think this may be the first time ever we've seen a president propose mandatory funding. My view is our education funding should be as certain as funding for other mandatory programs because we need to make sure that our kids in our schools know that money will be there year for year at the levels that are necessary. Let me just now turn to the issue of the apportionment process. And one of the things I've worked to do on a bipartisan basis is to improve accountability in the budget process by requiring the executive to report on the apportionment, the spending and timing of spending of monies that Congress has appropriated. And you're moving forward on that process, are you not?
We are. We met the first timeline. The Appropriations and Budget Committees have access to the system.
Thank you. No, I know no executive really likes Congress to interfere in this way. I don't see it as interference. I see it as a very important public disclosure process. I was glad that this committee supported that provision on a bipartisan basis years ago, and we included this provision, as you know, in the omnibus. And I want to remind people that this would have been really important during the Trump administration's time when they withheld money for weapons for Ukraine. So for months, they secretly withheld money that this Congress appropriated to help in the defense of Ukraine. In fact, they withheld it for so long that they violated the law. That's what the GAO found, that they violated the law by withholding monies that have been appropriated by the Congress. And I think as we reflect on the current moment in Ukraine, it's important to remember that episode. And I am pleased we now have in place measures that would address that issue through the disclosure process. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Lujan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To our ranking member as well, thank you for holding this important hearing today. Now, Ms. Young, thank you for being here. It's been an honor to work with you and to learn from you throughout the years. And Mr. Chairman, I had the great honor of learning from Shalonda, not just during my time now in the Senate, but during my time in the House. So, Director Young, congratulations on this very important appointment. Now, while there's many positive aspects to the budget, I'm going to zero in on some areas that I think that the Congress must improve upon as we get into appropriation season, and we're working on the next, what I hope is not an omnibus, but that we pass this in regular order, if you will. Director Young, last year President Biden released an infrastructure plan, and that infrastructure plan pointed out that he was requesting $18 billion to upgrade and replace aging Veteran Affairs facilities. Now, I know you're not the VA Secretary, but it's important to me to raise these issues because there's been a recent announcement that because of the passage of the Mission Act, which is being pointed to for the reason for this new document that came to Congress, 174 closures of CBOCs across America in every state, 4 in New Mexico in Hispanic and Native American communities. And I'm not okay with this. I'm going to find every way that I can to stop this from happening. And so hence, you're the first person I've had the honor to visit with, and so you're going to get the brunt of this, and I apologize for that. I know you're looking at this particular budget. Is it correct that you asked for $300 billion for the VA?
We are asking for $135 billion for the VA, their top line and discretionary.
And what's that increase? What's the percentage?
About a 29% increase from the 2021 level.
So that's important to note that there was an increase here. Of that, I believe, is it $3 billion for infrastructure?
Yes, sir.
So if it's $3 billion for infrastructure, I just want to encourage the team that worked with you for this specific budget part submission, just to look at the infrastructure package, which asked for $18 billion. Now, continuing to sleuth, I was able to find some other documents looking at the needs that exist for the VA. And in one of those documents, which is called the Annual Strategic Capital Investment Planning Process, the estimate was $72 billion to $88 billion for capital infrastructure over the next 10 years to maintain and enhance infrastructure for the VA. That's much more than the 18 that was even requested, which would have been a good start. But I think even through testimony and through newsletters and publications, the VA secretary said it's only a down payment, and that's referring to the $18 billion. Mm-hmm. Now, if there would have been a significant showing in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which I also supported, I don't know that we'd have these 174 potential closures. Then there's a claim that there's going to be 255 replacement facilities for these 174 closures by the VA. No one's told me that the one's coming to New Mexico, so my veterans are going to have to try to find care somewhere in a state that has a shortage of primary health physicians in 32 of 33 counties and a shortage of mental and behavioral health physicians in every one of our 33 counties. And we're not different than the rest of America. So you see where I'm going with this. I want to see what we can do to fix this, to get us back on track, to address this. I'm going to work with my colleagues, Democratic and Republican, being a freshman junior senator, to stop the closure of these CBOCs. Our veterans deserve better, and especially with a budget that's $5.8 trillion. I think that we can do better. So I'm going to be pushing on this, and I'm going to be vocal about this. Now, I want to thank you for the work that you are doing in the area of mental and behavioral health. Now, you've been asked several times, you've explained those provisions very clearly. And I just want to encourage the administration and us as members of the Senate and Congress to continue to push. While one of my colleagues did say this was bad, and I think it was Senator Sanders, this was bad before, it's only gotten worse, and it has. We're losing too many brothers and sisters in our communities, family members, and across America, and we've got to fix that and make that so much better. So Ms. Young, if you're able, well, I'll submit these questions to the record to adhere to time. I look forward to learning more from you, seeing how we can get in front of this with VA closures, but continue to say we can also increase investment to mental and behavioral health availability. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello, we speak again. I, for a second, just want to echo what Senator Lujan and others have mentioned in terms of uplifting and prioritizing the mental health and behavioral health elements of the proposed budget. As Senator Sanders put it well, it was an epidemic before the pandemic, and it's only been exacerbated since. So a lot more to work on there, and I would ask that we particularly be mindful of how we work in partnership with state and local governments, particularly those who have also stepped up and committed funding through their budgets. Let's leverage programs, let's leverage precious resources to maximum effect, and look forward to working with you on that. Now, mental health needs and shortfalls across the country, not just in my home state of California, is not the only factor, but it's a significant factor in the homelessness issues that we're experiencing today, coupled with housing affordability crisis. I also want to thank you for the levels of funding for housing in the proposed budget. I mean, similar to mental and behavioral health, the pandemic has underscored the need for affordable, safe, and supportive housing. And over the last 2 years especially, many have lost their housing, whether they struggle to keep up with rent payments or mortgage payments despite our assistance programs. And these hardships, no surprise, hit especially hard on communities of color, low-income families, Americans with disabilities, and other historically marginalized communities. Now, affordable housing is essential infrastructure. And I know other senators have talked about housing, including Senator Warner, but I just want to underscore that we have an ongoing need for robust federal funding for housing programs, more urgent now than it has ever been. I'll call attention to my Housing for All Act that I introduced several weeks ago that builds on proven solutions that have been developed at a state and local level, effective in terms of addressing housing, but with respect to unique challenges and opportunities in communities across my state, and you can apply that to communities across the country. So building on provenly successful models through these investments, I think, is a smart way to go. So in lieu of asking you a question on that, I just wanted to highlight and underscore my appreciation for that. Now, a question not unique to California, but probably disproportionate to the West, an issue of wildfires and disaster preparedness. As we've spoken on a couple of occasions, California and across the West, we continue to see how the climate crisis is leading to more frequent and more severe wildfires. And although we've made progress in recent years in increasing funding levels for federal land management agencies, Americans living in the West still need more support to truly address the growing problem. And that's both financial resources as well as personnel. Do what we might to try to prevent or mitigate the impact of wildfires. I can't help but notice that from 2019 to 2021, the U.S. Forest Service, which is the federal government's primary wildland fire agency, saw its firefighter ranks drop by more than 20%. In California, it's a loss of 1,000 employees. So I was pleased to see the budget includes $1.8 billion for the Forest Service and the Department of Interior to strengthen our federal firefighting workforce, increase capacity, and improve firefighter compensation. It's long overdue, but we know that's just a drop in the bucket. So, Director Young, can you discuss how these funds will address the firefighter workforce shortage and help chip away at the huge backlog of hazardous fuel reduction and post-fire landscape rehabilitation projects?
And I'd also like to point out the $1.8 billion is a $560 million increase. As you say, it's a start. It's not a finish. We also are upholding the president's commitment to make sure firefighters make a minimum wage of $15. We think that will also help with recruitment. And I know this is an issue of importance to Senator Merkley, who's not here, but one thing we also support is National Guard being used in a lot of these areas. We know that recruitment will take a long time to build up, so our National Guard presence has been a lifesaver, literally, for a lot of communities. So we remain committed to doing that as well.
Thank you very much. And in closing, Mr. Chair, I know the topic of inflation and interest rates back in the 70s and 80s came up earlier in the hearing. I'd just like to note for the record that from 1969 to 1974, there was a Republican president. From 1974 to 1977, there was a Republican president. From 77 to 81, yes, there was a Democratic president. And from 81 to 89, there was a Republican president. So happy to have these debates about the economy and interest rates.
I want to thank Ms. Young for appearing before the committee today. Her full written statement will be included in the record. As information for all senators, questions for the record are due by 12 noon tomorrow with signed hard copies delivered to the committee clerk in Dirksen 624. Email copies will also be accepted. Under our rules, Ms. Young will have 7 days from receipt of our questions to respond with answers. With no further business before the committee, this hearing is adjourned.